There is a huge problem going on within the gaming industry right now, and not enough people are talking about it. In the current modern gaming landscape filled with unending corporate greed, forced diversity and inclusion, and excruciating mediocrity, many of these big budget AAA titles end up being major flops on release day. We've seen this happen time and time again, and even more so recently as of late. I can name at least 5 AAA titles within the past year and a half that were major disasters, either commercially or critically. We got Forspoken, Skull and Bones, Concord, Suicide Squad, Star Wars Outlaws. And it wasn't like these games just got unlucky and rolled a natural 1 on launch day. Every single one of these titles had massive glaring issues with them that anyone with 2 functioning eyes can pretty much see from a mile away. But for some reason, it's not so obvious to these corporate suits and game journalists. For some reason, the main issues that caused their games to fail eludes them like some sort of grand mystery that was set up by the Riddler himself. But that can't be further from the truth, because the reason is actually crystal clear. So clear in fact that even some of the people internally on the dev team can see right through it. However, this isn't really the main issue because sometimes the devs actually do make a good game and it just didn't pan out the way they expected to for a variety of reasons. Shit happens, you know. But for those studios, it's a learning experience for them. The actual problem stems from the fact that a lot of modern gaming companies and dev studios nowadays seem to vehemently reject criticism from anyone, while only accepting reaffirmation and validation, which ends up creating an extremely hostile work environment where developers are too afraid to speak up because it could risk offending somebody in the office. This is what's known as toxic positivity, when the company is more focused on creating a safe space in the working environment to the point where they actively reprimand anyone who they deem as offensive. And according to the Ubisoft insider from Legendary Drops' video, these offenses can be as minor as not putting a smiley face emoji at the end of your work email or including one too many exclamation marks. This is to pretty much prevent any sort of criticism that a dev might have of how the direction of the game is going in order to protect the feelings of the other coworkers. They are actually strong-armed into not saying anything, or else they face repercussions from HR and possibly risk losing their jobs. No wonder these games are released in such a shitty state. This is literally 1984 except with blue-haired liberal white women instead. Many of these modern AAA studios have already begun to integrate this toxic positivity workplace culture into their own, and now the consequences of it are just starting to rear their ugly heads. For example, Concord was in development for 8 years and cost probably $500 million to develop. So why is it that throughout their near decade-long development cycle, nobody said anything about the character designs, the gameplay, or the audience reception? Well, that's because nobody said anything, even though anyone from a mile away could see that Concord was going to be a disaster on launch day. Everyone but the game developers and game journalists themselves. They seem to think that the reason it failed was because of the bigoted chud gamers who hate diversity and just want every character to be gooner bait. They don't think it had anything to do with the gameplay, the atmosphere, or even the character designs themselves. And that's because the developers dug their heads in the sand and consciously made the decision to ignore all negative feedback and continued to keep on making the game the exact same way. And as we can all see, the consequences of ignoring crucial feedback can be pretty disastrous. The problem with toxic positivity over just any normal toxicity is that instead of trying to be as mean as possible in order to hurt the other person's feelings, you're trying to be as nice as possible in order to protect their feelings. This includes pretty much any and all criticism because that criticism can be interpreted as harmful even if it's presented in a constructive way. But the thing is that this helps no one. Letting people make the same mistake for years on end and having them suffer the consequences without ever learning from it is just as bad as telling them that they've only been making mistakes. That's how we get so many games that are just so aggressively mediocre nowadays, because of this philosophy of trying to be as inoffensive as possible, which in my opinion is even worse than having just a bad edgy game. Now, why are so many companies adopting this toxic positivity mindset? What's with the sudden uptick in them? Well, the most obvious reason is because of the current political climate within the Western AAA gaming scene. Right now, as a society, we're pushing for creating more safe spaces so that everyone can feel comfortable and included. And you know, I'm all for people creating safe spaces for themselves within their own social groups. If you want to make a gender-neutral body positivity fan art of some obscure character and share it with your friends, then go ahead, you have every right to do it. But the line is drawn once you put your niche worldviews in a commercial product meant to be sold to a massive public audience. When you do that, you're no longer making a product that you want, you're making something that other people want. So that means there's going to be some pushback for something that's outside of the norm, especially with an audience that's historically known for being toxic. And naturally, this toxic positivity culture would bleed into the workplace because more companies would start pushing towards this direction. Another reason why toxic positivity has started to pop up more recently is because what I speculate to be an overcorrection of the abusive working conditions that so many AAA gaming studios were so infamously known for. It's no secret that game developers have historically been treated very poorly in the past. Soul-crushing overtime and crunch hours, recurring sexual abuse against women, lack of competitive pay. There was even that one time a couple of Blizzard developers had what they like to call the Cosby Suite. And notice how each of these studios that are trying so hard to push positivity in their workplaces are also the ones with the most skeletons in their closet. Which leads me to believe that after being caught with so many scandals and class action lawsuits of sexual harassment, these studios have overcorrected themselves and went to the complete opposite end of the spectrum in order to rectify their past sins. Pretty much every studio that's trying to push for diversity and inclusion now has had some sort of incriminating scandal in the past. Blizzard had a boatload of sexual abuse allegations of women in their workplace that eventually led to the death of an employee and a class action lawsuit being filed against them. Now it seems like they can't stop putting pride flags and queer people in their games. Ubisoft also faced multiple allegations of sexual harassment and misconduct against women. Now they're pandering to minorities and playing the oppression Olympics to see if they can one up themselves each time. And Sony, you guessed it, also had a class action lawsuit filed against them for sexual harassment and discrimination. And now they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to create games that are diverse and inclusive, and as you can see with what happened to Concord, that ship crashed and burned. Horribly. It's like these corporate executives just saw a few game journalists who write these stupid articles get offended by not having enough representation or having some sort of made up issue that they interpreted as problematic in their own mind. And because of that, they're just making everything lame and gay so that no one will get offended, which actually ends up doing more damage to the cause and helping it because the quality of their games usually suffer as a result, which leads people to hate them even more. And I think me and many other individuals are actually accepting of homosexual and minority representation in gaming as long as the game is still good. But the problem is that oftentimes they're not good. The gameplay experience almost always suffers as a result of the developers focusing too much on trying to spread their message rather than make a fun game. And after years of doing this, these companies are finally facing the consequences of their actions. Now, toxic positivity doesn't only just exist within AAA gaming studios, there's actually a self-sustaining ecosystem of toxic positivity within the entire industry as a whole. It's not just the game studios, it's also the game journalists that are responsible for this as well, because it's pretty plain that they don't actually give much criticism to these studios as they should be. I'm pretty sure you've noticed that their game reviews often don't really match the audience's expectations. They're often way more lenient on big AAA titles, giving them passes for many things or even just outright ignoring their major issues. For example, in IGN's review of Concord, they gave the game a 7 out of 10, which is considered a good game on their scale. But for anyone with 2 functioning eyeballs, they would see that this game is anything but that. It was easily one of the most generic and uninteresting looking titles to ever be released in the modern day, and that's not just my opinion, that's what everyone thought, which is why the game died in just 2 weeks. But why did it die if these reviewers gave the game a good score? Well, it's because they don't want to criticize these publishers too harshly so that they can still remain within their good graces. Gaming news outlets like IGN, Kotaku, PC Gamer, or what have you usually get special privileges from AAA gaming studios such as early access, free review copies, special media tours, etc. And those privileges can be revoked at any time at the publisher's discretion. This is what's known as access journalism. The games journalists play nice, then they get free stuff. It's pretty simple. That's why so many game reviews never really provide any actual criticism to games that deserve it and often downplay huge glaring issues. Using IGN's Concord review as an example again, it was pretty obvious that the reviewer tried to downplay many problems with the game that were actually pretty severe in the average consumer's eyes. Like, instead of calling out how generic and uninspired the game was, the reviewer just says that they quote-unquote play it safe.
And you might have something close to the feeling of Concord. As competitive hero shooters go, this sci-fi contender from Sony plays it quite safe.
And what's funny is that the reviewer himself even mentions how formulaic Concord's gameplay is, but then immediately just devalues that criticism by saying it's not that bad.
And a zone control mode called Clash Point, to name a few, none of which possess even the slightest hint of novelty, but being overly familiar isn't necessarily a bad thing if you've got best-in-class gunplay and awesome characters with compelling powers to back it up.
And this is only one example out of the many where reviewers don't exactly review games as substantially as they should. It's because they don't want to be the ones that make the whole publication lose their special privileges from that publisher, which just serves to feed more into the toxic positivity cycle. Look, I understand that no one likes to hear criticism, and no one wants to be the guy that breaks the bad news. But because of that, we're now getting below average AAA gaming experiences that no one wants to play, all because developers and executives don't want feedback from the audience. And when they do get it, they'll call us talentless freaks or toxic right-wingers or any other label to diminish our feedback. They think we're toxic and therefore our opinions don't matter. Well then, the next time they launch a game and it inevitably flops, I'll be sitting here watching from the sidelines telling them, "We told you so."